What's up everybody, Ashraf here. Welcome back to Ash English. Great to see you again. Today we're going to dive deep and practice contractions. This is part 2. If you haven't watched part 1, I'll link in the description. Now, contractions will help you increase the speed of your spoken English. Native English speakers use them all the time. Our focus today is contracting the word would. So, please do stick around here until the end of the video. Alright? So, the first one. I would. I would becomes I'd. I'd. Listen and repeat. I'd. Let's have an example. I'd like to ask a question. I would becomes I'd. Like to becomes like to. Ask ye becomes aska. I'd like to ask a question. Okay. Next. I'd. Repeat with me. I'd. He knows I'd love him whatever he did. I'd love him. Alright. Next. I would. I'd. I'd. I'd leave now if I were you. I'd leave. Instead of saying I would leave, we say I'd leave. Okay? Repeat with me. I'd leave. Alright, next. You would becomes you'd. You'd. Repeat with me. You'd. Let's have an example. You'd never guess she was over 60. She was over 60. Okay. Next. You'd. You'd. I thought you'd be interested in this book. I thought you'd be interested in this book. Okay. Awesome. Next. They would. They would becomes they'd. 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 Listen and repeat. They'd. Let's have an example. They'd come if you ask them to. They'd come instead of they would come. Okay. Next example. They said they would be happy to help. It becomes they said they'd be happy to help. They'd be happy. They'd. Listen and repeat. They'd. Excellent. Next. They'd. They'd love to see the film. They'd love to see the film. Okay. Next. I wonder if they'd like a drink. I wonder if they'd like a drink. Okay, next. We would. Contraction of we would. We'd or wit. We can pronounce this two ways. Strong or weak. Weed or wit. Weed. We would becomes weed or wit. Weed. Weed or would wit. Alright, let's have an example. We'd be grateful for an answer. We would be becomes we'd be or would be. We'd be grateful for an answer. For an answer. Okay. Next. We'd better. We would better becomes we'd better or we'd better. We'd better hurry up. Okay. We would becomes we'd or we'd. Alright. Next. We'd rather stay. We'd rather stay. Okay, next example. We would have come if we'd been asked. We'd been asked. Okay, next. He would. Contraction of he would. He'd becomes he'd. He would becomes he'd. Alright, let's have an example. I'm sure he'd help if he could. So, he would help becomes he'd help. Alright, next. He'd. He'd come if you asked him. He would come becomes he'd come. Repeat with me, he'd come. He'd come if you asked him. Okay, let's have another example. I wish he'd stop bossing me around. In this case, he'd stop means he would stop. I wish he'd stop bossing me around. Great. Let's have another example. He would. I wish he'd get a haircut. I wish he'd get a haircut. He'd. He'd. Alright. Next. She would. The contraction of she would is she'd. She'd. Repeat with me, she'd. Okay, let's have an example. She'd like to come with us. She'd like to come with us. She'd. Instead of saying she would, we say she'd. Alright, let's have another example. She would be becomes she'd be. She'd be a great managing director, don't you think? She'd be. Okay. Next. She'd. She'd. She would becomes she'd. She'd love to see you. She'd. Repeat with me, she'd. Alright. Okay. She would. She'd. Repeat with me, she'd. She'd come if you asked her. She would becomes she'd. She'd come if you asked her. Okay, next. It would. It would becomes it'd. 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 It'd be great if we could finish today. It would becomes it'd. Okay, let's have another example. It'd. I thought it'd be better to wait until later. It'd be late better. It'd. Okay. It would. It'd. It'd be better if we finished it today. Okay. It'd. It'd be impossible to capture her beauty in painting. it had been possible to capture a beauty in a painting. It did. Alright guys, that's it today. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. If you did, hit the lovely subscribe button and tap the notification. Don't forget to give a thumbs up. Cheers guys.